All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our April San Francisco Products That Count webinar. Today is a must for product leaders who are navigating one of the most important, but I'll say often overlooked challenges in scaling a product, which is how to build and evolve a monetization strategy. From early product market fit to late stage expansion, each phase demands a different approach to turning value into revenue. And we're here with Deon today to unpack it all. But before we jump into that conversation, I want to share a few highlights about what makes Products That Count community such a valuable space for product professionals. First of all, it is a community of over 500,000. That's a staggering number. Product managers reached. So we are one of the largest and most influential networks of product managers globally. Next, there are thousands of expert resources from C-level and VP podcasts to thought-provoking articles and video content. Our library is really built to support product leaders at every stage of your career. So whether you're looking to sharpen your skills, explore new trends, or really just become a more effective member of the product team, Products That Count is really a great go-to destination for product excellence. All right, well, let me take a minute to introduce myself. My name is Denise Hemke, and I'm your host here with San Francisco chapter of Products That Count. And outside of my involvement with Products That Count, I am the Chief Product Officer at NeoGov. And if you're not familiar with NeoGov, we build purpose-built human capital management and public safety software for government agencies. And I'm excited today to welcome a friend of mine, our guest speaker, Deon Crasto. Until recently, Deon was a head of payments and risk at Velocity Global. And he brings a wealth of experience leading monetization, platform strategy, and product innovation at companies like Checker, Livongo, and OnDeck. He's helped teams navigate complex product life cycles from that early stage pre-product market fit to global scale, with a deep focus on how to align product and revenue strategy. So this session today is going to be packed with tactical insights, strategic guidance, and real-world examples. Perfect for PMs working really at any stage, from early stage startups to later stage scale-up companies. Now, before we dive in, one last housekeeping note. If you have questions during this session, please don't hesitate to get those queued up. We're going to spend the first half of this session going through, Deon's presentation to you all, and the back half of the session will be live Q&A. So in your Zoom, and if you're unfamiliar with it, you can find it in the ... at the bottom. There should be a Q&A section, or it'll be under its own item if maybe you have it expanded. So please use that, log questions there. And then during the back half of the session, we'll field those questions and you'll get a chance to ask Deon live. So with that, let's get started. Welcome, Deon.
Thanks for
Take it away.
having me.
Absolutely.
There we go. You can see my screen, right?
Looks great. If you could just stick it in slideshow mode, then we'll be golden. All right, ready to go?
All right. Let me tell you a little bit more about me beyond just like my professional background. So these are more fun facts in terms of like from a product background. Like Denise mentioned, I've been at Velocity, OnDeck, Livongo, and Checker. I primarily worked across a bunch of different industries, but my core background has been within payments, pricing, and billing, and the monetization strategy as a whole. But beyond that, from a more fun fact version of me, I'm obsessed with cooking. I almost dropped out of culinary school before I got into computer engineering and computer science and all that fun stuff. So if I wasn't doing product, I think I would probably be cooking somewhere. My second fun fact, which I think people still are a bit shocked about, is that I've never driven a car in my life. So I've navigated living in 7 different cities, some big, some small, and it gets trickier in smaller cities, but never driven a car so far. I speak 5 languages, and I primarily grew up across 3 different countries and 7 cities, like I mentioned. For the topic of this conversation, I want to structure it in terms of like 4 different themes. I want to talk to you about what is monetization. I think people different understandings of it, and I'll give it to you from like my lens. And I'll talk to you about why it matters. Then I want to jump into early stage pre-product market fit. What should you be thinking about? Should you even be thinking about monetization? Should you put it for something stream? Then I'll talk about scaling, which is once you've reached a certain scale and you have to think about monetization, how do you go about thinking it, and what levers should you pull? I'll then jump into like the infrastructure layer, which is getting a little more nitty-gritty in the details. If you had to like break down a monetization structure, an engine into its building blocks, what would it look like? It primarily falls into like 4 buckets. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit more about if you do want to get into monetization, what are some side hustles that you have to manage that come with the job? And I'll leave some time for Q&A. But that's the structure I want to follow. Happy to answer any questions as we move along. Monetization from a product lens. I want to talk about this. Before I jump into this, I think I want to talk about some core concepts that will help align the conversation. And we can like jump into different sections from how we see this evolving. Monetization for me, I think, is the value/capture loop, and it's a loop, right? So typically, if you have a great product or a product in general, the idea is that it creates value for your customers. How that value is captured for you or your organization is through a great monetization strategy. So an equivalent value proposition could be something like great products create value, monetization strategy captures that value. And it's a loop, right? The more value you add to a respective product suite or to your products, the more you can charge higher prices for it. So you have to think about it in terms of that lens. If you keep adding value and you don't capture that value, you're giving things away for free. On the flip side, if you keep jacking prices up and you're not changing anything in the product, you open yourself up to a bit of churn and probably bad customer sentiment in general. So how do you think about the balance? I think it's something that's important, and we as product managers should think about that on a more holistic level. My second core concept is pricing as a hypothesis-driven experiment. So pricing for me is the ability for a product manager or a product leader or someone in the org to say, we think we deliver X amount of value and we should charge Y for that, right? And you could add a lot of value, but you could not have someone willing to pay for it. So you should be thinking about pricing as an experiment to just test what is customers' willingness to pay. There's a bunch of different ways we can kind of like do this. There's really heavy engineering-driven efforts, and there's really scrappy ways to think about this. I'm happy to like jump into that in like a later stage as well. But you wouldn't launch a new product without testing it out with customers. You shouldn't launch a new pricing model without testing what the customers think about this in terms of their willingness to pay. The third thing I want to talk about is packaging from a positioning lens. Packaging, for a little more background, is if you have a bunch of features bundled in together and you sell it as a product, that's how you think about packaging, right? So that's the core value proposition of pricing and packaging together. And I want to talk to you about it from a positioning lens, and I have some anecdotal evidence, so experiences through this. Packaging typically tells your customers what the product is and how it should be used. So you have to go a little more deeper into understanding customer segments, customer behaviors, and what are the most common iterable loops that you can kind of like sell for a respective product. If you make packages too confusing, or if you give customers the ability to pick and choose too much a la carte, you end up creating a world where it's just open to too much customization. And on the flip side, customers might not even know how to use your product in terms of what its intended purpose was, which can be good and bad depending on your circumstances. And the fourth one I always want to talk about is you want to evaluate what the customer's willingness to pay is. which we spoke about initially on the pricing side. But the key goal is you could create a product and it could be amazing. But is a customer willing to pay for it, right? So is the value threshold, does the value threshold cross a certain mark where the customer wants to pay for it and wants to be a sustained customer in the long run? So you want to test that out. You want to see how we can like go about doing this in a much more sustained manner. Why does it matter? Like, why are we talking about this? Why is monetization a conversation in general in the landscape? I think, and I've been in product monetization for like about 10 years, and I think product is included too late in the life cycle when we start thinking about a strategy for like monetization. Typically, what I've seen happens is sales or someone in the company says, "Hey, we want to like launch a new different product." Finance says, "Okay, here's what our COGS are. So here's what the cost of goods sold are. We want to add margin on top of that." And then a PM or someone is looped in and said, "Okay, cool, you want to like build this and you want to like package this and you want to sell this. Let's go about building it," right? I think that's too late in the funnel because you know, they're typically playing catch up to product decisions that they weren't involved in. So my take is I think pricing and packaging are product decisions, which start off with pricing with product having a seat at the table when these discussions are actually going on. Then they shouldn't be finance afterthoughts and you shouldn't be coming in slightly later. And so I think product, finance, sales, and all your stakeholders should be collectively in the room as it happens. Timing over perfection. Depending on what stage of the company you're at, I think people over-index too much on finding the right pricing model and the perfect pricing model. I think that's not the ideal strategy. I think you should start off with just having some hypothesis of like what pricing should look like, and you can pick one, right? You can go with seat-based, you can go with premium to paid, you can go to regressive pricing, depending on what your model is or what your business is. But at a high level, I think you want to optimize for just having some model in place to evaluate willingness to pay, and then you can like optimize beyond that. The third one I want to talk about is a competitive mode. If you're in B2B sales, or even if you're in a B2C product, which is a commoditized product, you can think about it in terms of like a sale, like a Uber or a Lyft, right? Typically, customers aren't just evaluating one product; they're evaluating a host of products in the market. So one way to think about it is if you have smart packaging and if you have smart pricing and you make the evaluator's life simple in terms of picking your software, picking your product, I think it's a really strong lever that most companies don't think about up until it's too late. So I think nailing your monetization strategy at some level within these different lenses is an important aspect as well. I see the chat. Is that the chat buzzing?
Those are questions for later, so I'll hold off on them.
All right, sounds good. All right, jumping into where you're at in terms of like your strategy or your company and what these different things look like in general. So my ideal, I've broken this up into like pre-product market fit, post-product market fit. If you're really early into your life cycle and you have a product that you don't know if is going to sell or is customers even want it, my hot take is don't even think about like the whole like pricing model and the strategy and all that fun stuff and building automation and tools and all that stuff. I think you just need to evaluate what customers are willing to pay for it, and is it sticky enough for them to keep coming back. So you can start with like a very basic single pricing knob. I've done that like certain companies where we've tried to evaluate if this is even the right pricing model, this is the right product, if this is actually even valuable to like a customer if they want to pay for it or not. I can start off with like a freemium gated version and then move on to like usage kits, relatively straightforward. And if you're selling within like a more B2C environment, there's different models to evaluate. And if you're a founder, if you're like an early stage employee, typically you can do this through like Excel sheets and like manage them. I've seen companies at 50 million ARR that actually have their entire price book in Excel sheets. And they have formulas like govern what a bill should look like, and someone manually creates an invoice. So I know it works. Is it scalable? Probably not. I mean, it works for certain companies, but I think if you want to get really gritty, I'd say just evaluate if this is the right model you want to think about, and this is the right product, and you can plug tools in to like make things work. So my key takeaway from here is start with clarity, not complexity. Make it simple for people to understand what the product is. Don't invest in technology too early on, because you might probably have to pivot in terms of what your strategy looks like. Pitfalls to avoid. I wish someone told me about this early on in terms of like my career. So I kind of like drawn those in this slide here. I don't think one customer should define your entire monetization strategy because it is in the market. Now there's some caveats to this, but typically if you're building some custom feature for like the one customer, the two customers that you have, that might not be iterable. You're just adding a lot more pricing depth, or just adding a lot more monetization somewhere down the line that you will elevate yourself for. So my take on this is, unless there's an avenue to build an iterable loop, or more customers might want this, don't think about signing up for edge case products or features or pricing models. Now there's an exception to this. If the customer, the partner that you're working with is a proxy for the market, then it's a really good strategy to like evolve and like understand their needs and see if it might be scalable. So that's one exception. There's a couple more, but I think you can kind of like gauge it in terms of what kind of like fits. The second one I want to talk about is premature tiering, or like pricing tiers. My general take on like bundles is like you should keep it to a minimal, and customization should only be offered for like really edge cases or customers that might need a different segment altogether. My problem with offering tiers too soon, or offering tiers too customizable, is that you again get into monetization or like pricing debt, which then becomes difficult to unwind. I've been at some companies where we wanted to roll out a pricing change for all of our customers, and it took us, I think, like 14 months, just because there was so many different edge cases and so many different pricing tiers and so many different contracts that we didn't even know about, that we just signed up for, right? So my takeaway from this is, if you can push it off and you can just start off with like, get to like 80% of the problem with just like the basic tiers, I'd say go for it. And there's certain caveats where you can think about it, but that's what I'm talking about. My third one is over-engineering billing. I spoke about this earlier, but I don't think we need. I don't think you need to get to a certain stage of like building custom invoicing stacks, or like custom payment stacks, or custom pricing stacks. I think if you want to think about it in terms of like, depending on what your product is, if it's a consumer product, if it's a B2B product, pick what the most common payment methods are. Think about payments, right? Typically a B2B company will pay you through a Brex or a Ramp, or they'll pay you through an ACH or a wire. So those are the simple, streamlined. 95% of customers fall into these payment methods. Only start with these. And then you can go to the edge cases if you want to think about it. Internationalization, all that fun stuff, I think comes in later. So don't over optimize for adding more tech debt on your engineering teams. And the fourth one I want to talk about is siloed finance decisions. So siloed finance stakeholder decisions. I don't think people should start off with that is a finance person's job, or that is someone in the CFO org's job to give me what those different buckets should look like, and I'm going to implement those tiers. I think PMs should ask really deeper questions in terms of value proposition, and is this something that's scalable, or is it just a test? If it's a test, it's totally fine to start off with like a small proxy and evaluate it from there. But I don't think they should be done in silos. Okay, now everything I just told you about until that point, I think falls short, because there's obviously going to be some need to evolve based on what stage of the company you're at. So if you see your customers kind of like churning or like falling at like paywalls or like upgrades, or if you're in a B2B environment, if you see customers navigating away from your product suite, primarily because you don't offer certain reports, you don't offer certain billing models, or you don't offer certain payment methods. That's a consideration to like think about, should we evolve, right? The second one you want to think about is like high value customers that have been around with you for the journey, suddenly asking for like, hey, we need X, Y, and Z, and you're not offering flexibility. So you want to grow with your existing customer base. So that's the easiest way to like validate the market and validate the need for certain billing and pricing models. So I'd say that's another signal that you should probably be paying attention to. The third one is something that we saw pretty heavily at a couple of companies that I was at, which is support tickets just ramping up in terms of complaints about our billing or our pricing confusion, right? So I've been at companies that one of our goals was we wanted to reduce billing contact rates by X percentage because it was so bad. And we said, what is the complexity? Is it invoice explainability? Is it the pricing model, or is it just unmet expectations? So we bucketed them into a bunch of different factors, and we just said, oh, we have a lot of tech debt and we have a lot of confusion, and we should really be solving for this. So that became one of our core pillars for the entire year. And the fourth one is sales and customer success is already doing this, but they're not telling you about it, or like there's no automated way to do this, but they want to close their quotas. It's probably another way to just like think about, okay, we probably need to like evolve this and build a stack for our customers or our segments in general. Some levers that we can kind of like play around with. I want to talk about like packaging experiments. Again, this depends on like a couple of things. It depends on one, what industry you're in. If you're in a B2C environment or if you're in a marketplace, packaging is different than if you're, let's say, selling to enterprise customers or selling to mid-market customers. So think about packaging experiments in terms of like bucketing the right package for the right customer segment, and see if that's scalable. The second one you want to think about is like pricing fences. If you're selling to an SMB, your ability to price certain products is completely different from if you're trying to sell to an enterprise customer who has an evaluation process across a bunch of different vendors, right? Also, an SMB will probably ask for, based on your product volume, X, and an enterprise customer might ask for like 50X or like 100X, just based on the volume that certain things are trying to drive. So think about price fences in terms of that and how you kind of like want to control it. We have a lot more control in certain levers there. Third one I want to talk about in terms of a lever is really investing in automated billing and pricing. And again, you can kind of like evaluate that based on what your signals look like. So if you think there's investment that's warranted within billing because you're spending, say, 5 days a month just like closing your end of month invoicing cycle, maybe that's an opportunity to like invest in automated billing and like pricing strategies. Tooling is an interesting one. I saw this at a couple of companies where vendors or like companies would come in and tell us that we really like your product. Like, this is great, but it's making our lives internally or my finance team's life a living nightmare because we don't have the reports in terms of like reconciling all these different things together. So we really want to have reports, or like we really want to have tooling. Typically, I wouldn't have thought about this as like a monetization PM's role or like even related to that, but I've seen certain traction falling off. So, and depending on what tooling you're offering, I think it's an important lever to drive because it ends up becoming like a customer or a product differentiator. And the fifth one probably is if it gets to a certain stage where you need a dedicated PM, that's when you should think about, okay, this isn't scaling really well, then what should we do here in terms of like resourcing and adding more headcount to certain problems? Probably the last lever to think about. But these are interesting ones that I think popped into my head just from past experiences. I want to talk about this slide, and this, hopefully this isn't too overwhelming, but we've used something very similar to this at a bunch of different companies. And if you want to think about what does a monetized engine, a scalable engine look like in practice, I think this is it. At least one V1 of it, right? So any monetization engine or any infrastructure layer for monetization primarily can be broken down into like four main pillars, which is the pricing, which is typical price book at a very simple level of like, what do you charge? The billing side, which is at this very basic level, a metering engine. So if you think about price, $10. How many times did you use that in terms of like the metering engine? 10 times, 10 into 10, 100. That's what typically is the invoice amount that you're supposed to pay. So print that on an invoice, add your tax, and then add a payment method or the ability for a customer to pay. So those are the four kind of like pillars, if you think about it at a very streamlined basic level, just pricing, billing, invoicing, which a customer gets, and that's start with the, and then payments as the next lever or the next pillar that we should probably optimize for. Now I'll focus a lot less on users and features. I'll probably talk a little bit more in terms of like what we care about for these different segments. From a pricing lens, if you reach a certain stage or a certain scale, you care about is my pricing infrastructure customizable, and is it scalable for some use case that I might have 18 months or 12 months down the line? Or am I building a product or an engine that only scales for existing needs? So typically, you want to have certain levers to pull, but if you want to add a new product, it ends up becoming a really minimal lift in terms of adding a new pricing structure, a new SKU. So those are your key. Hey, this is what we really want to care about, and this is what we care about in terms of like building a pricing stack. For billing, which typically are more platform teams because they're more backend oriented, what we care about here is accuracy of the usage metrics. So one thing that you want to hate doing is, or you want to hate encountering is, if you bill someone for 100 credits and the customer comes in and says, oh, I only use 87 credits. It destroys both user trust, and it creates this weird case where have they been overcharging me for a bunch of different instances, right? So having explainability for billing and having accuracy for the billing tracking metrics thing is an important use case. You also want to think of scalability of different models, not just today, but maybe like 18 months down the line. I don't like thinking too far out, but I think 18 months to like 2 years is a typical model you want to think about in terms of like billing, right? So maybe we just do end of month invoicing. Should we do prepaid models? There's a new use case you want to like release tomorrow. What does it look like from launching this for our products, right? So I want to think about that. I think it's an important consideration to have. Invoicing and payments are interesting because this is the first, I guess, threshold where a customer is interacting with your stack, right? So invoices are basically what gets sent out to an AP team for your customer. And there are multiple users that actually interact with your invoices, or depending on your use cases, right? So typically there might be someone who's just invested in like making sure the payments go through. So someone that's a user role. Another user role is essentially, was the invoice paid on time? A third one you can think of was the payment method added for the right model that you're trying to like evaluate. And the fourth one you want to make sure is that are these invoices easily auditable, and do they have like trails? So these are different things that you want to care about, or we should be caring about in terms of invoicing. The features kind of like add into like different levels or like levers that I think kind of like we should be thinking about. And this again depends on your specific use case, right? If you want to go more into like enterprise, typically customers want multi-org invoices, they want sub-entity invoices. It's really confusing there, but different use case based on your needs. And the payment stack is the last one, which again ties into customer touch points. So here you care about, are we getting paid on time? Are we making it simple for customers to pay us on time? What is our collections or our delinquency rate? Stuff like that. So you can think about internationalization and certain features and expansion and all that stuff as well, as like another lever that we want to care about. But at a very high level, this is what I think PMs should be invested in as like key metrics or KPIs that we want to move. Features again change depending on your use case, but at a high level, you want to think about can we handle multi-currency for like internationalization? Do disbursements go out relatively easy? Do we have reports in terms of like if a payment method fails? And those are different levers you can like think about and you want to like play around with. But at a high level, these four kind of like scale for like the use cases that I've been at. All right. Now that we've kind of like spoken a little bit about like the core product and the core kind of like problems, I want to talk a little bit more about stuff that isn't so obvious, right? And depending on the scale of the company you're at, there's certain revenue like risk ops that I think play into a monetization PM's role, or typically a monetization team or a finance team's role in general. The first one that we actually saw at a few of my companies was friendly fraud and chargebacks. And we kind of like nailed it down to one of two reasons. One, the way that we were describing our invoices or credit cards weren't really explainable, and they kind of like had a lot of doubt to certain customers, especially on like autopay. But it kind of like pops in, right? So you might have some bad actors trying to exploit certain vulnerabilities and charge you back. So how do you handle those use cases? It was a very interesting experience to kind of like think about working with payment providers in terms of making sure that you're not a victim. So interesting use cases that you can kind of like learn from them. Delinquency and collections. Typically based on like the size of the company that you're at, this might not fall into your gamut of responsibilities. You might have a the complete team focus on collections, or you might just pass collections on to a collections agency. But I think it's interesting to think about this in terms of how can you make it simpler for customers to reactivate and pay their invoices in like streamline loops. I've been at some places, I've been at like, I've seen instances where if you want to reactivate your account, you have to contact support, or you have to contact someone in sales, and you have to like do all those different things, which I think adds too much friction. So how do we go about enabling customers that have gone delinquent to like use the platform again? I think is a monetization/growth lever to kind of like work on. The third one I want to talk about is, especially with experimentation being so key to everything that we've just spoken about, how do we think about AI or machine learning in this case in terms of like building defense layers? And they extend to a bunch of different use cases, right? Like we've spoken about pricing and pricing sensitivity and pricing experimentations. I think it's a completely novel space where you can think about building tests, split testing certain aspects by seeing what customer sentiment might look like, right? I saw an interesting use case where we don't have the exact model of the company that was doing it. They said, but they looked at demographics and the user and the business size of the business, and they changed the prices to see what customers would accept or wouldn't accept. It's a very interesting experiment, right? They said, okay, cool, we believe someone in San Francisco, tech-enabled, tech-forward, we think their ability to pay is X plus delta, which is above the median. So let's see if that actually holds. And it was an interesting experiment to see if people like either convert or fall off, and you kind of like validate hypotheses through that. You can also use AI for like detecting fraud. I think they did really well with like pattern recognition, or at least flagging for like human in the loop use cases. So probably something to like worth investing in and evaluating. And the fourth one you want to think about is like rule changes, especially in payments and billing and compliance. Things just change. So if you have a rigid system that doesn't move or doesn't or is difficult to kind of like change, I think a tricky part about that is as PMs, you're spending a lot of your time managing compliance paychecks or managing something just so someone on legal isn't hounding you down to like change something. So probably worth keeping in mind. It takes a lot of time off your bucket. So I keep that as top of mind, or at least side of mind in terms of like side hustles that we should be investing in. Next, I want to talk about if you're interested in pursuing this as a career option, or if you want to hire someone specifically for this, what does that look like? I think monetization PMs sit at this like very interesting nexus of products and like value, but also P&L across the entire portfolio. My ideal monetization role is I like PMs sitting horizontally across the entire product suite. So you're not really invested in any product line, but you see the value in terms of adding across the entire packaging and pricing and the general customer value, right? So you're not tied into any one product. You see how do you price and how do you bill and how do you add value across the entire subsection. So it's a very interesting role. And if you can add real dollars or like real revenue behind the value, if you quantify it, I think it's an amazing role if you're interested in that. What matters here, I think you need to have some level of like pricing economics and packaging. Just in general, how are things priced? What is willingness to buy? How can we test certain things out? I think is an interesting value to have. You need to have a certain level of curiosity and understanding experimentation. And you can obviously learn this right through a bunch of different experiments. But I think having an innate interest in pricing or like monetization or like money in general, I think is a pretty interesting characteristic to have. I always go back to my personal experience as well. I fell into monetization by default. But when I was a kid at 11, I always thought about, I would go to weddings and I would look at catering events and I would always wonder, cool, this is priced at so much. I'm assuming they sell at so much. Here's like a margin improvement. And I always thought about like, okay, cool, dessert is an add-on. Do they price that like additionally, right? And I was like, I think 11 or 12. So I always thought about ideas in terms of how does it fall into like, how do you make money on those things? So I think it's having some level of curiosity is always interesting. Third one I want to talk about is payments, sales, and like compliance literacy. I think payments literacy and sales literacy is probably the most important one, which is can you talk to your sales stakeholders? Can you get them on board with what you see or where you see the world evolving? And probably can you partner with them well enough where they can tell you, hey, we're seeing this thing coming down the pipeline. What do you think in terms of like serving their needs? Can we do this? Can we not? So having regular check-ins with sales, I think is like a super interesting aspect that gets typically overlooked for PMs. But if you're working in monetization, I think you definitely have to have a really close connection with like on the revenue side. And the fourth one is basically good storytelling in terms of here's what we're building, here's where we're building it, and here's why it matters to the company. And here's why we should either do this or not do this. Right? So you need to get people on board if you're trying to make changes to pricing because it affects everyone in the life cycle. So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right. So if we had to loop it all back, right? You have to think about pricing as like an iterative test where you want to evaluate a customer's willingness to pay and you want to run experiments on that. My key takeaway here is you wouldn't launch products without testing them out. You shouldn't launch a new pricing without going through rigorous testing to see if it actually works. And if it just works for one segment, if it works for the entire market they're trying to target. The second one I want to talk about is the value capture loop. You want to understand, again, it's a loop. You want to understand if you're adding value, are you capturing it? If you're capturing too much revenue, are you adding value back, right? So thinking about the entire life cycle of it and making sure there's a balance so that customers don't feel alienated about like jacking up prices or moving prices up. I think is an interesting use case and can kind of like get through that to like a bunch of different customer segments as well. Third one I want to talk about, I want to loop back is don't scale too late. I think you'll reach a certain inflection point where you have to think about infrastructure. Don't push it off too late where you're spending too much time and you have to invest resources. Keep thinking of it as like a tech debt so you can bucket it and you can do small iterative loops every sprint or every quarter to like make sure you're making some changes so that it's not just one big pile up at the end of year 4. Like, okay, let's go like build an engine or an infrastructure layer, right? And the fourth one I want to talk about is don't just think about monetization as like pricing, right? Because if it was just pricing, then you could have someone in revenue do it for you. But you want to think about this in terms of how do you build sustainable engines that scale beyond just pricing, and also look at if you want to add a new use case, if you want a new product, if you want to add a new pricing tier, can we do that quickly? Or do we have to go back to square one and like think about this from a new lens? I think that's, yep. We have about 20 minutes, but this is my, so you can find me on LinkedIn and that's my email. And I'm going to pause there.
Amazing. Thank you, Deon. I've got lots of questions for you, but if there are other questions, again, please don't hesitate to queue them up in the chat. The first one that was asked was, when you're talking about pricing and packaging and sort of the, product being a product decision or finance or sales, did you mean that pricing and packaging are product decisions as well, in addition to finance and marketing, or are they solely product decisions?
I think they're all in collaboration, but I think product should have a certain say in terms of determining if the value add is legitimate, right? I think on a recurring basis, typically what companies like doing is, like, hey, contracts are up, we want to increase prices by, let's say, 2% or 3% or whatever the COGS value add is, right? I think product should be at the table to say yes or no based on, have we added more value, or are we just doing it because we need to jack prices up because COGS increases, right? So I think it's a conversation, but I think product should definitely be at the table to like evaluate and think about the value proposition as a whole.
And maybe like with that context, I guess, like how do you make sure product has a seat at the table? Let's say that, you're the product person, maybe you don't have somebody who specializes in this or not yet, and you're kind of focused on building the core product. How do you kind of earn that right and that credibility?
I think a large part of like it is just having good. This doesn't just like translate like monetization, but I think having relationships with like your stakeholders is super important, and positive relationships. And the way to do this is having common shared goals and empathy for where your stakeholders are coming from, right? So sales or finance or revenue aren't just thinking about silo goals. They might be, but like you could be thinking, you could pivot it to a certain way. It was like, how does A, B, C, or D help the company or like the organization achieve its goals, right? And you want to have one common theme. I think in my past experiences, I think that's what's kind of like helped, which is getting a common thread in the room, empathizing with your different stakeholders so they see common ground. They're like, okay, cool. He or she understands where I'm coming from, and then kind of like bubbling it up from there. But I think it's a conversation, and it's just an exercise in relationship building and kind of like moving on from there.
And are there typical like friction points or misalignments where you've seen, and how have you navigated those? Like maybe sales thinks more is more, right? Higher price
Yeah.
is better because that helps me hit my revenue target. I don't really believe that's the case because, I know that they obviously need to be able to move the product. And if it's priced too high, obviously that's not the scenario. But, where does that misalignment come from? And, can you share maybe some personal stories on how you've navigated some of that?
Yeah, like a couple like pop into like my head. I think the first one is more organizational. I think sometimes sales just have like quotas that you need to kind of like hit in certain levels, where it's just like the alternative is if you don't like jack prices up, like pricing is the next lever, right? Like, okay, we can't grow sales beyond X, Y, and Z. The next lever that we can pull is pricing. So stages. So that's one. Two, I think not having a clear differentiation of like the market, like what does the market look like and what does the competitor landscape look like, and then evaluating it from there. I think is an interesting kind of like world. I'll give you an example. I used to work at this company called Livongo. For those of you unfamiliar, Livongo was an AI healthcare chronic care condition management platform. And the idea was if you live with diabetes or hypertension, they could kind of like solve. So it was a SaaS recurring model, right? So every month, so long as the employee was enrolled, you'd make recurring revenue, whatever the price was, $80 or $100 based on the employee. On my third day of like joining the company, my company got acquired by this company called Teladoc, which is a consumption-based general practitioner. If you want to go see a doctor, you have a common cold, you want to go out and see that, right? Now, these two models are completely different. One is recurring revenue. You know what's going to come in. One is, I don't know when I'm going to fall sick. I want to go see a general practitioner. When we wanted to marry the two of them together to serve a single product, we just didn't know what the pricing would look like, right? Like, do we charge a SaaS-based product like at that level, or do we charge a consumption-based billing model, right? And who do we sell it to? And where does this come into? So there was a lot of sales friction in terms of like, we want to do this, but the customers want this, and health plans, because you're selling the health plans, was completely different. And they're like, we don't know what you're selling and how to position it. So it took us a lot of time to like build that product differentiation out. And I think we took a deep breath and said, okay, we want to focus on something called whole person care, which is if you live with a chronic condition, and if you want to extend into certain other products, then we give them to you in certain bundles, right? So proving that out to like a bunch of different internally to like sales teams, and like, here's what we want to push, and then going to health plans and understanding where they're coming from, then going to employers was an exercise. But I think initially there was a lot of confusion, like, how do we sell this product? So it just depends on how you want to like focus or like streamline it.
Yeah, it's not an easy problem to navigate, but it sounds like with a lot of research and maybe back to your point about like pressure testing and experimentation, you're able to kind of get to a conclusion on that. It may be pivoting a little bit. Some folks are probably working for sales-led growth companies. Other folks are working at product-led growth companies. Do you think monetization looks different in these two different worlds? Is that an axis that you think about that delineates monetization?
You mean PLG versus SLG companies?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think it definitely does. I think if you're if you're working for a PLG motion company, the way you monetize is so driven on value add as opposed to like sales led motions, because you obviously have a lot more people involved and like invested in the process. For PLG motions, if you think about it in terms of either upgrades or like upsells, or if you think in terms of like adding new products, they have to see value in the existing product to then go and add or tack on something more, right? As opposed to someone in sales calling you, say, hey, we launched a new product and like a really good deal for you. Do you want to like go and like evaluate it? So I think the value add process, I think, is a lot more important in like PLG motions. And you can kind of like pressure test this in a bunch of different ways, right? Which is, I have a friend's company who was doing this, who was in the early stages of like getting to like a motion, and his evaluation was like a false door, which is like, we have this new product that's coming out. Do you want to like sign up for this, right? And he has no pricing model. He doesn't know if he wants to build it on. He just wants to see, are people willing to pay for it, right? So like click a button, and then as soon as you click on the button, it says, you're added to the wait list, like we've reached our cap for like this. But like now has data to tell him or inform him that customers want this and are willing to pay. And he can add it to like a bundle or a product or a suite down the line. So I think experimentation falls more kindly to like PLG motions, and you have a lot more room to kind of like wait around with.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It's like the classic, like very, very, very MVP. Like don't even build a product, just build, a wait list or just build a homepage. That's great. I want to go back to something you said a minute ago, though, was you talked about, like willingness to pay and experimentation. And so, if pricing is a hypothesis, right, then what is your favorite kind of low cost way to test willingness to pay? So you're not spending a lot of engineering effort iterating on something that may not be the end state.
I had a different answer, but I think what my friend, like what the person was doing in terms of like testing out how you can see if a customer wants to pay, I think is like a really straightforward, low effort, no engineering kind of like person like involved. And it does two things, right? It gauges interest, one, which is, do customers want this, right? And two, are they willing to pay, right? Because typically, I don't know the experiment, I remember the way that it was structured, which is free upgrade tier available, click this button, cost X amount, enter credit card details. So now, someone is actually getting to like the stage where they will enter their credit card, right? Which then probably is a pretty tangible, measurable place that you get to a certain level of like, okay, people are gonna add a credit card here. But you don't want to be in some places, you don't want to do that because you don't have a product that's ready to ship. So,
Yeah.
but you now have data to say that customers do want this, right? So I think that's one way you can like do it.
But willingness to pay is also often, what are they willing to pay, right? I may be willing to click that button if it's $5. If you tell me it's $25, I'm not going to click that button. And so do you typically like A/B test in those scenarios, or are there ways that you've tested even outside of the product that you'd recommend to folks?
Yeah, so that's a great point, right? So you can A/B test it. You can kind of say, hey, here's certain things. You can also look at churn. All right. So if you bump up prices to like, and like your hypothesis might be something like, I believe we're ordering X amount of value, which yields X amount of revenue for the customer, which validates a 20% increase in pricing, right? Like Netflix keeps doing that, right? Netflix says, hey, I'm gonna bump my prices up by X percentage. Here's a 3-month reminder, whatever. And then they evaluate churn, which is like at the end of the day, do customers see perceived value through that? Or are they churning because the change in price was so high that they want to move away with it, right? You can evaluate that even through like really small A/B tests. So you can say something like, send out emails like a really small cohort and say, hey, we're going to move like prices up to like certain thing. And if you get a lot more like feedback from customers saying, no, that's awful, we want to like cancel our accounts, you have enough signal to like either change something or just like make a decision call, which is like, okay, we're ready to like let go of, X amount of churn because the revenue increases by so much. So that's a trade-off that you have to like evaluate, but I think there's ways to kind of like do it in a very strategy way as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've all probably used a product too where you go to churn it, right? And then it's like, oh, but will you stay with it at this price point, right? And so
Yeah,
there may
there's
be
there's,
like
there's
A, B, C, and a D test.
yeah, there was some, I don't know what product I was using like about like 3 years ago. I sign up for things. This is my internal like weird state where I sign up for things and I forget I signed up for it. And then like 3 months later, I'll be like, I want to use that product and I already have an account and I go to cancel it. And I was like, oh yeah, here's a 75% discount because you haven't like logged in and like we feel like really bad and we don't want you to go. So like here's it for like $5 instead of 20. So I think there's certain things that you can kind of like test in terms of like what are customers willing to pay. And if someone says I don't want to cancel because it's $5, right? Then it's become okay, cool. Are they cool with 5? Would they be at 7? Would they be at 10? And you can like test it out in that kind of like sense as well.
Yeah, kind of find your floor. And maybe a follow-up kind of question that someone asked on this is, how often can you iterate on pricing without confusing and upsetting existing customers?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I think the answer depends on what product are you selling, right? If you're selling to like a customer, an end user customer, I think you have a lot more pricing elasticity and a lot more leeway with like testing it out with like end users. If you're selling to like an enterprise customer, which might have like a 3-year contract or like a 2-year commitment or something, your ability to iterate on prices has to be premeditated, like 6 months to 8 months before you go to that respective like customer, right? So it depends on the segment you're targeting. It depends on what model you have. It depends on a bunch of different like streams and like use cases. So there's no one size fits all. If you really want to run experiments, I think marketplaces or consumers are probably the easiest one because if they don't like it, they'll just like cool churn or they do something different. But if you alienate a complete like a large customer on like pricing, then it's a bit of a tricky situation to like navigate. So there's no clear answer on that.
Yeah, and consumer transactional is probably your sweet spot for experimentation, right?
Yeah.
Uh, you'll get signal quickly and they're going to come back again. So I love that kind of the range and the spectrum based on the use case, the model, and the segment you're selling to. Any strategies you'd recommend to make sure we're not giving away too much value through aggressive sales discounting?
Um, Aggressive sales discounting. I've learned this later on in my life, and I didn't think about it as much. There's two ways to think about this, right? You want to, and I didn't talk about this earlier on, but if you want to think about how can you make your product a non-commodity, you want to think about two things. One, how can you make it really sticky for them to switch costs, like switch providers, right? And the easiest way to evaluate that is, are they going to build integrations, or are they going to like embed your product in like a workflow that they have on a recurring basis, which basically then becomes a really important switching cost, which companies don't want to account for. They don't want they want to move away from it as much as possible, right? Simplest example that I can think of from a consumer good is something like Spotify, and it's Apple gives me 3 months, like I get a notification, hey, here's 3 months free on like Apple Music or whatever. Please like sign up for this or whatever. But I'm so used to Spotify because one, it's like embedded in like different workflows in my life. It knows so much about me, it tells me all the concerts that I want to go to. So there's like this inherent, I've built certain like loops in my head that I think it's important for me. I think one thing about that, right? So if discounting gets you to a certain lever where the value add is you get more stickier with them, I think that's what you want to kind of like target through like a proxy in some way, shape, or form. But typically I've seen there's two metrics to answer the specific question, right? One is you want to evaluate COGS, which is what is your cost of goods sold, right? And two, what is the minimum amount of tack on that you can add to like deliver value for your company as a whole, but also two, to make sure that churn isn't like too high, right? So if there's a sweet spot somewhere out there, I think it works. I've been at like B2B companies where I've seen products marked up by like 70% on like certain on like web models, and I've seen the same product offered at 7% above COGS. So like literally a 90% discount just based on like the customer that they're trying to like target. So volume comes into the picture, customer sentiment comes into the picture. Can you use that customer to like get a new lead? Like for instance, if you're selling an AWS and AWS as a customer, they're a flagship customer, you now know you can go to like Google, you can go to like a bunch of other companies, say, hey, we have this thing, like it works for them, NPS is really high, we want to use that as a lever. So discounting can be thought of like in a bunch of different ways, and the value that brings about can be thought of in a bunch of different ways, but at a high level, I think it's a more nuanced answer. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think the other thing maybe that you could talk about here is, that typically from a tactics, like a control perspective, is a lot of tooling will put limits in place, right? Where sales can't discount over a certain level without approval processes. And so maybe talk about that, because I suspect could also be that there's a lack of familiarity on the side of like use cases and how one might build that into the system.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right. And I've seen this like implemented in a few different ways, right? So typically if you're like an SDR or a BDR or an AE, you get X amount, which is like, if you're using Salesforce, right? Salesforce is the best example. They set a flow of the discounting that you can offer. So let's say you want to hire, let's say you want to like use like 100 credits, right? 100 credits, the maximum that a sales rep is allowed to like discount, maybe like 10%. So that's the maximum that they be allowed. Now, if you want to get one lever above that, it has to go to like your manager, which could be a manager of sales, right? So then he has a discretionary decision, which is you can then pass on to him through Salesforce, and he makes a call, which is cool. I want to add another 5% that I have through my power. And then it goes up to the loop where it could go to something like a VP. Typically, you want for like small volume, but you want to have controls in place where people make calls on what discounts are offered, and there's, I guess, more controls in terms of that's not offering like 50% to like someone, right? So that's how you think about it. That's how I've seen it work in practice, just based on like levels and roles and how people have discretionary power in terms of what they can or cannot discount.
Yeah, and I think to your earlier point, like that's that governor, right? Then that kind of keeps that aggressive discounting from happening without getting folks engaged. And you may find that, to your earlier point, maybe you have to be 7% above COGS for this customer, but it needs to be a very, very intentional decision that you didn't just have some rogue salesperson aggressively discount without anybody at the executive level kind of aware of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. And then how do you scale monetization for a marketplace when the product has viral growth? Like assuming this is only one-sided with the customer, with paying the customer.
Is that a question in the chat?
It is a question in the chat. How do you scale monetization for marketplace when the product hits viral growth, assuming that only one side was the paying customer, the supply side?
That's an interesting question. And it depends on, is virality like sustained or is it a one-time taper off, right? I think with like, especially with like consumer products, The tricky part is the LTV. I've seen this like way too many like apps where there's this like immediate surge on like demand or like interest at a faction. And you want to like think about like, oh, do we want to like monetize them on the long term and increase LTV? Or do we just monetize them at this respective moment and then think about like next kind of like what happens in like a different section, right? This is not a marketplace product. I mean, this is a marketplace product. If you think about like how Clubhouse kind of like boomed up in terms of like the early stages of like COVID and everyone was on it. Their revenue model was completely different. But if you think about a world where you could like optimize for that surge and then price accordingly or like bill accordingly or like monetize accordingly, I think that would be an interesting lever. I think it depends on, is it sustained growth that you can kind of like increase LTV over like a life cycle, or is it like a one-time, we're just in this right now and we expect like the surge kind of like taper off at some point in time. So it just depends on like what kind of like cycle you're at, I think, and for like the marketplace products.
Got it. I have one last question. I know we're a little bit over, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you. I could ask you questions all day long. But you talked about these four pillars, right? The four pillars of infrastructure and pricing, billing, invoicing, and payments. And if I'm somebody who's kind of getting into this game, I guess I'm curious, like, where am I best suited to take something off the shelf versus build something custom?
Ah, I could, I like so this I could probably talk for like about 30 minutes. Um, I think yes, this is a typical buy versus build versus partner kind of like a use case, right? And I think you wanna figure out which of these different like segments or in general, whatever the breakdown is, can be solved through like a vendor in its entirety, right?
Hmm.
As opposed to only 75% or like 25%. Like for instance, there might be some billing, like Stripe billing, right? Stripe billing solves for like 90%, like 80% of the use cases, but we still have to do like 20% like custom, and that 20% ends up becoming like 40% general and 50%, and Stripe becomes like a certain like just like a side tool that manages edge cases, right? So if I was evaluating it, for me, what I like thinking about is not just the use cases today to satisfy everything today, or will it satisfy things down the line that we want to get to, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I would like them to solve for 100% of the problem space, as opposed to them solving for like 80% or 85%, because the more custom code that you add or the custom use cases that you add, you're adding more tech debt. So in my world, I like thinking about like, if you want to buy, make sure you're buying a solution that solves for everything or like near everything and scales for the future as well.
In your experience, like as you think about kind of moving from pricing to payments on that like spectrum of the pillar, is payments typically the place where you can solve like for more use cases with something off the shelf, and then maybe like pricing or cases where you're going to differentiate because your model is different? Like, is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, that's a pretty good, that's a good model. Typically payments is I think payments is the easiest one to like optimize for, right? Because Stripe does pretty much everything, and Adyen does similarly, and like Chase has different products, has been doing this for like time immemorial. So they've figured out all the different like use cases of like what payments would look like. And payments is relatively binary. You want to pay someone, you can pay them on a model. And the end of the day, it's just moving money from like one account to the other, right? And your modes of payments are very streamlined. So I think payments is the easiest one to do. Billing and pricing, depending on the complexity of your products, right? And what you want to offer can get really complex. So if you want to order seat-based, you want to order freemium to upgrades, if you want to order pricing, you want to order, if you want to offer volume-based discount, you want to all for all those things coupled in together, like different levers, that's when things get really confusing. And if you want to integrate that with Salesforce and you want to get that going into like a different ERP, that's when you add more use cases that probably don't fit really well for like one respective software or like one respective tool. That's when you might have to like ask a question, okay, cool, are we okay with like this just solving 80 or 70% and building custom, or do you want to build like this custom side for us? Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah. And I think those are the places too where there's probably the most ambiguity around like, is it going to solve for 100% of the problem space? Well, I don't know, because I might be early in the cycle of experimenting.
Yep.
So I think that's great advice and guidance. Again, Deon, your expertise is so deep here. I could ask you questions all day, but unfortunately I can't. So I'll have to close it here and just say thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. This, of course, will be available on the Products That Count YouTube channel, How to Product. So if you want to review the content that Deon's gone with you again today, you'll be able to play it back and take that expertise all day long. All right, well, thank you. Appreciate your time with us, Deon, and thanks everybody. Take care.